Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here, and what a rich conference, timely, and certainly the focus of the element is something that we're all talking about these days. So it's a pleasure to be a contributor to a very important conversation. And with my opening slide, it is the right thing to do. It is timely, generous, and just to have water for Great Salt Lake. See if I can operate this thing. Okay, so Friends of Great Salt Lake was founded in 1994. Our mission is to preserve and protect the Great Salt Lake ecosystem through education, research, advocacy, and we were actually inspired by the work that the Mono Lake Committee did. Mono Lake is a sister saline system of Great Salt Lake, and it's in the eastern Sierra Basin of California, the western edge of the Great Basin. It's a system that is much smaller than Great Salt Lake, saline in character, which makes it very complex and mysterious at times. But the value of Mono Lake and its importance to migratory birds from a brine shrimp community that is a part of that system, for recreation and tourism is notable. But in the 40s, the city of Los Angeles was basically diverting the river systems that would feed Mono Lake. And they essentially dropped the system by about 40, 45 feet, doubled the salinity. And the system was really in a state of total demise. But National Audubon and the Mono Lake Committee got together. They were working on educating the public to practice better water conservation measures and engage the public in being a part of the solution rather than a part of the problem. But ultimately, the Mono Lake Committee and National Audubon Society brought a challenge, a public trust challenge against Los Angeles Power and Water, because Mono Lake, as Great Salt Lake is a public trust resource, which means that Mono Lake, to Californians, it belongs to the people of California. And California has a jurisdictional responsibility to manage that system in perpetuity as a public trust for the people of California. Just as we in Utah have our public trust resource and the Division of Forestry, Fire, and State Lands in the Department of Natural Resources has the jurisdictional responsibility to manage this system as well in perpetuity. And this is in the Utah Constitution. So the inspiration of the work that the Mono Lake Committee and National Audubon did, they eventually, their challenge, their public trust challenge was taken to the California Supreme Court in the 1980s, and they prevailed. And what prevailing on a public trust challenge meant was that they got to work with Los Angeles Water and Power to determine a settlement that would recognize an elevation of that system that would essentially acknowledge all of the ecosystem values that that system has inherent to it. And it's taken quite a while. It took a while for the settlement to be determined, but there is an elevation that California is striving toward in order to achieve that ecosystem viability. So shortly after Friends was founded in 1994, we conducted a public survey, and these were the major threats that came out of the response from the public. And they aren't in any particular order, but they're all meaningful, and they all have the same power, the same recognition as far as a threat to the system. Climate change, our growing population, water quantity and quality, development on and around the lake, and the public who doesn't understand what the value of the Great Salt Lake ecosystem is all about. So with that as a way to go forward in achieving our mission, knowing that water is the lifeblood of the Great Salt Lake ecosystem, we persevere. I think most of you are pretty familiar with the fact that the lake is a terminal lake, which means there's no outlet. The only way that things leave the system is through evaporation. It is part of a 21,000 square mile hydrologic system. There are, there's groundwater connectivity, streams, and certainly 3 major riverine inflows. The Bear River, the Ogden Weaver, and the Jordan River. And the salinity factor of the lake is divided into 5 bays. And depending upon which bay you might be in, the salinity can vary from 4% salinity to 27% salinity. So the nature of the ecosystem is really, it's challenging, but it is what it is. And thanks to a white paper that Dr. Wayne Wurtzbaugh, who is a professor emeritus at Utah State University, and his cohort put together, they studied tree ring data, and they basically determined that since statehood, the average lake elevation of 4207 at the time was significantly dropped over time from upstream diversion, dropped by 11 feet. And with that, salinity increased. Certainly the volume of water decreased. And all of these inherent values that come with this system were compromised. Navigation, mineral extraction, certainly habitat values. And here we are, living along the shores of something great. Utah is the 2nd driest state in the nation. We use an embarrassingly amount of water per individual, and we have a lot of work to do in that department. We have projected population doubling by 2060 to about the size of Philadelphia, primarily located in northern Utah around Great Salt Lake in the 5 counties. And certainly that brings those impacts to uplands and wetlands and air quality issues. And as we know that climate change is a part of our reality, and that with our dependence upon water, primarily from snow, with climate change and higher temperatures, we know that the trend is going to be probably more precipitation in the form of rain, and the timing of inflows or runoff is going to significantly influence things like habitat, food sources for birds, and certainly those values of Great Salt Lake that are reliant upon water. This is a 46-year fluctuation of the lake, if I can get it to work. Yes. And up until 1989, there was a 11-foot plus increase. And then as we go forward to 2018, we have a 17-foot decrease. So the lake is a dynamic ecosystem. But certainly we are contributing in a big part, to influencing what elevation the lake is able to achieve. We know that since July of 2021, when we hit the historic record low, the 1963 historic record low of 4191.3, since July of 2021, we have hit a number of continuing record low elevations of the lake. This certainly has impacted navigation, and salinity concentrations have been increasing as a result of that. Whoops. And with the declining lake level, we have what many of us commonly refer to as the Great Salt Lake coral microbialites. Microbialites are calcium carbonate structures that come from a groundwater percolation into the lake bed. Ideally, they eventually are covered with algal mats of cyanobacteria and various critters that provide important food sources for brine shrimp and for brine flies. They play an integral part in the life cycle of the brine fly. And we're seeing with the declining lake level, more exposed microbialite beds in Great Salt Lake, which is very troubling because they actually contribute to about 33% of the productivity of photosynthesis in the system. These are Artemia franciscana brine shrimp, and brine shrimp are harvested. The harvest began this month. They're harvested sustainably by the Great Salt Lake ecosystem, through the Great Salt Lake Ecosystem Program and the Division of Wildlife Resources. But brine shrimp have an optimal salinity range of about 12 to 17% salinity, where they do best. And particularly the juvie brine shrimp, and juvies, are kind of temperamental anyway, but they have a more difficult time unless the conditions are really optimal. So the brine shrimp right now, with salinity concentrations in the system, on the verge of exceeding 18.5%, are in big trouble. And according to the ecosystem program, which again is this sustainably managed model for the brine shrimp industry, brine shrimp can maybe have a couple of years of viability with live births and that kind of a contribution to the ecosystem. Brine shrimp are also important food sources for millions of migratory birds. And these are brine flies, another important food source for migratory birds, also reliant upon salinity concentrations. And again, with 18.5% salinity concentration and growing, they too are struggling, particularly with the microbialites being exposed. And a part of their life cycle is to have their larvae attached to the algal mats on the microbialites. And then the pupae stage, no, I have it wrong. Yes, no, larvae and pupae, right. The pupae goes up to the surface of the lake, and then the adult brine flies fly away. They break down organic matter, but again, they are an important food source for millions of migratory birds. And there are over 11 million migratory birds that come to Great Salt Lake, 338 different species. And the ones that I've highlighted are totally reliant on brine shrimp and brine flies. And because of that, the eared grebe and the Wilson's phalarope could be likely ESA listings because of the impairment of their food sources. Eared grebes in particular have been surveyed to come to Great Salt Lake in the millions. And what they do is they come in fall, they molt, they double their weight on brine shrimp, and then around December, they migrate south for their winter migration. So there's a lot at stake for these birds. And the Wilson's phalarope, staging concentrations actually put Great Salt Lake on the Western Hemispheric Shorebird Reserve Network map. So these two species are kind of key in terms of their food sources and what we might think about as we move ahead. And I think most of you are aware, thanks to the Great Salt Lake Collaborative and daily news coverage on the lake and water and our practices, Dr. Kevin Perry from the University of Utah Department of Atmospheric Sciences has been working on the exposed lake bed. He's been characterizing the salt crust, and he has determined that the availability of salt crust into dust could contribute to health problems for the growing Wasatch Front. And we can take that as a reminder of the Owens Lake example, a system that was drained totally dry, again, in the Eastern Sierra Basin of California, but we don't want to go there. So there's a lot of work to be done to avoid that. This is the railroad causeway, Union Pacific Railroad. In 2011, there were culverts on the causeway that were closed because of integrity issues. And the state basically worked through a 404 permit with the Army Corps of Engineers and a 401 certification permit to build a breach that they could actually control the flows of salinity and water from the North Arm to the South Arm. And there are performance goals that they are adhering to. But the breach was just recently raised 4 feet to prevent North Arm salinity from coming into the South Arm. So it's an adaptive management tool, but it's one that is a work in progress, and hopefully it will help win the day. Currently, there's another issue in addition to the impact of the declining elevation of the lake, and that is the proposed intake canal expansion of US Magnesium. US Magnesium is the largest producer nationally of magnesium, and you know the value of magnesium. But because of the low lake level, they're unable to get water from Gilbert Bay, which is the south arm of Great Salt Lake, into their operation to continue harvesting the magnesium. So they have gone to the Army Corps of Engineers asking for a 404 permit, and they are also asking the Division of Water Quality for a 401 water quality certification permit to allow them to go forward with their work. There are a number of problems that are part of this proposal, and among them is essentially they would be relying on about 161,000 acre feet of inflows from Gilbert Bay a year to their operation. And for all of the work that we're doing with legislative tools and funding nearly $500 million to create partnerships and water leasing and water inflow opportunities, this would be contrary to that effort, mostly because in a way we'd be topping off US Magnesium's tank of water inflows. So there's an opportunity to provide public comments. That deadline has actually been extended to the 12th of November. But again, a lot of tools came through the legislative session. In 2019, House Concurrent Resolution 10, the lake is in a state of decline. What are we going to do about it? There's a report that came out in December 2020 that essentially I was a part of, a very good working group of good thinkers, where we came up with 16 opportunities and 60 recommendations to address a declining lake. And I think this matrix here is really the basis of how we go about doing that. Educating and engaging primarily is the first stepping stone. Information improvement, decision-making, optimization of agricultural water use, optimization of municipal and industrial water use and land use planning, refining legal and policy options, and continuing to sustain these efforts over time. And this is Speaker Brad Wilson, who has been a champion for the lake, who has really helped enable a lot of this legislation to come forward. So what I think would be a useful way for us to proceed as we're talking about buying water rights or working on water leasing and encouraging water to come to Great Salt Lake is figure out what our target is going to be, so we know what our results are. And as every one of us in the room working from a tricycle to a two-wheeler, remember, we had to have training wheels, but at least we were moving forward. And we knew that we were on a two-wheeler and not a tricycle. So here's the tool. Looks like a stained glass window, but it's a Great Salt Lake elevation matrix. It was part of the 2013 Great Salt Lake Comprehensive Management Plan that the Division of Forestry, Fire, and State Lands, again, they have responsibility for the jurisdictional management of the system. They use this to help inform the guidance of the resource of Great Salt Lake. We are off the chart down here. 4188.7, we should be up here, green is good. So my suggestion to the speaker and others is let's use the matrix as a way to account for our actions and our inflows, so that these values on the top are ecosystem values that are determined by if the area is green or if it's orange or yellow. This is impairment. This is viability. So with that as a guide, why not? For all that we want to be doing for Great Salt Lake, if the Bear River Water Development Project goes through, I mean, it's part of a legislative act, we need to do what we can to discourage that from going forward. The Bear River provides 1 million acre feet of water annually, mostly. This would divert that from coming into Great Salt Lake, and it would be basically all of the time, money, and effort going into the lake would be for naught. And this is just part of Wayne Wurtzbaugh's white paper and how, with additional development, how the lake declines. And so it's just a way to think about, what are we going to do? But what are we going to do is what we all have to do. We all have to believe in the lake. We all have to work to help educate and engage our neighborhood and our cohort and our colleagues so they can be a part of the solution. There are lots of opportunities, and this legislative session is right around the corner. So, get ready and be active. And again, the lake is who we are, where we are, what we are, and it's a reflection of all of that. So this was from the gather last week at the Day Riverside Library and some of the thoughts that came out of that conversation. Okay, thank you.
Okay, hello everyone. Thanks to Len for that great presentation. Yeah, my name is Nate Housley. I'm with a group called Save Our Great Salt Lake. I need to do a disclaimer. I moderated a panel earlier in my role with Utah Humanities. This is like a Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde kind of situation. To make it completely clear, Utah Humanities does not do political advocacy. So just anything that I say up here, don't get mad at Utah Humanities. Anyway, so I just want to introduce the group that I'm a part of, and then I want to talk a little bit about what is the role of a historian? What is the role for humanists and environmental advocacy? Because I don't know that it's always an intuitive connection for everybody. It makes sense to me, so hopefully it'll make sense to you by the end of this. If anything makes sense to you at the end of this. but that's what the humanities is for, is let's take something and try to make sense of it. Anyway, yeah, so the group is called Save Our Great Salt Lake. That's the name of the organization. It started around this time last year. The founders are friends of mine, and they listened to a podcast with Bonnie Baxter, Dr. Bonnie Baxter, where she talked about this kind of imminent collapse of the food web at Great Salt Lake. And they thought, alarm bells went off, and they thought, let's raise a big ruckus. Let's do whatever we can to raise awareness around this issue for anybody who might not have heard. And they planned a rally. I mean, I was kind of like in the orbit of this at the time. They planned a rally for the legislative session in January of this year. No, that was this year, I think. That was 2022. Yeah, I don't have any grasp on time at this point. And the objective was just, hey, let's do something. Let's make a big stink. Let's make a big noise. Not the most strategic approach, but it was, like, hey, we got to do something about this. So after the rally, I got more involved with the organization, and the conversations from, spring of this year through to like the end of the summer was like, okay, now what? What do we do? The organization still is, building the bus as we drive it to a large extent. But at this point, we've got a little bit of better grasp on what it is that we want and what we want to accomplish. I mean, during that time also, there was a lot of conversations with people like Lynn, with experts like Lynn, who lent their knowledge about the situation to just people, just average people. I'm a historian. I don't know anything about brine shrimp, and early, before this year, there's a whole lot of stuff to learn, a lot of stuff that is out there that needs to be understood in order to really grasp the situation. And so there was a lot of that kind of catching ourselves up to speed, building relationships with the people who've been doing this work for such a long time, and trying to find a place for, what is it that we can bring to the table. We didn't know it at the time, but Dan McCool from the University of Utah, he in his book River Republic, he has this idea, he's this concept of instigators, right? People from all walks of life who discover a problem, discover an issue, and they just start having conversations and start talking about it. And that's kind of what we have been doing. And so me as a historian, so I started digging into this issue. Well, okay, sorry, getting ahead of myself a little bit. So the organization over this process of conversations internally with other people, other organizations that have been working on this, we came across this movement in the legal world. It's called the Rights of Nature movement, and this is a group of lawyers and legal scholars who want to give rights to non-humans. They want to give legal rights to ecosystems. And this has had some success in the last decade or so around the world. If you've heard of this, you might have heard of in New Zealand. There's the Wanganui River, which has rights as if it were, a human person. And the indigenous Maori of New Zealand are kind of have a role as like stewards, where they speak on behalf of the river in the kind of human systems of law and policy, et cetera. This is not a, this is an idea that was articulated by a law professor in the 70s, Christopher Stone, and he wrote a book called Should Trees Have Standing? And his idea was, corporations have rights as if they were natural persons. The non-human, environment around us shouldn't have rights as well. And so that kind of thought experiment kind of percolated after a few decades, and now, it's something that people have latched onto around the world, and we think there's a lot of promise in this idea, specifically for Great Salt Lake. And so what we are working towards is getting rights for Great Salt Lake to have the amount of water that it needs to be healthy and resilient. Lynn talked about the public trust doctrine for Mono Lake in California. I mean, it's essentially the same idea, right? Like essentially the society that we have has no rights, has no legal teeth for the ecosystems that we depend on, that are essential parts of ourselves and all parts of human existence. I saw somebody proposed just in the last couple of days. I just saw online somebody proposed, let's make Great Salt Lake a national park. A similar kind of idea. I mean, the idea is, hey, this vital part of our society here needs some kind of protection and law. Otherwise, we're going to continue to divert and drain all of the freshwater sources that feed it, and it's gonna dry up. And with climate change and with the aridification of the climate, this is happening so very rapidly that if we really don't get our heads around this, it's I don't know that Great Salt Lake is going to be completely dry, but we are looking at, as Lynn pointed out, the lake is getting saltier as time goes by, and that poses a real threat to the food web for millions of birds. I mean, this is crisis mode. We're in crisis mode, and we need to really take this seriously. So what is my role in all of this? Well, a bulk of what I do is go and talk to people and try to bring people in to this kind of a collective that we have. It's not a very formal structure, and we don't have we don't have everything super tightened up and targeted, but we're trying to make that into a strength where people can bring in whatever kind of skill set that they have. People can come in from whatever role that they play in their everyday life, and make a difference. And for myself as a historian, I came into the situation, and I wanted to know what the deal was, right? So in my day job with Utah Humanities, with the Think Water Utah program, I'd had my head in Utah water and Utah water history for 2 years at that point. And so I knew a lot. I knew a lot of things that were going on. And there was still just some kind of like essential thing that I just wasn't quite grasping. And so I knew if I was going to be able to like communicate, okay, what is the problem? What is the deal with Great Salt Lake? If I was going to be able to communicate that, talk about the problem, propose solutions, I had to get my own head around it. And what I discovered is it's like a real big pot of gumbo, and you got everything in there that you could ever want. Anything that, water touches everything, right? There's an aspect of water in every part of our society here. And so that posed a challenge to me. How do I explain this giant pot of gumbo to people? How do I make sense of it for myself? And where I hit the books, right? Fortunately, a lot of historians have already tackled the issue of water in the West, and so I was reading through, you know, as much as I could get my hands on, you know, having been through grad school, it made it, you know, pretty doable for me to like pick up a book, and without taking too long, I could get the argument and get the kind of analysis and the framework. And also, you know, at the time and currently where my head was, and where my head has been, is in looking at the development of the Western United States as a region, and looking at the concept of the frontier, right? Looking at the concepts of settlement. And I came across Donald Pisani in his book, Water and American Government. And so I came across his argument. I said, okay, I think this is the thing that's going to help me make sense of this. So his argument in that is that the development of the Reclamation Service in 1902, this is an extension of the free land policy of the 19th century. So he comes out and says, you know, free land in the 19th century has become free water in the 20th century. He says that reclamation is the last stage of manifest destiny. So I said, okay, this works for me. You know, this was not exactly what I had necessarily expected to find. When I went in, I wanted to find the Scooby-Doo villain. I wanted to like track him down and say, like, you're not really a ghost, and pull off the mask, and here's this guy who's wreaking havoc on our water and drying up Great Salt Lake. And, you know, it's this guy, he's the villain. Let's get him out of here. And I don't think that's really what is happening, right? I think that if we look at the system of water that we have, that was developed, you know, in the early 20th century, through the 20th century, now into the 21st century, I do think it is an extension of that push for settlement into the West, and this development of settler colonialism in Utah. That makes things very complicated. That is a difficult thing if we're going to try to get to the root of the problem. Hey, that's in our culture. That's in our ideology. That's woven into policy and law, and it touches on so many different things. And we're going to have to try to walk that back and extract, you know, some other kind of more sustainable, resilient way of relating to water and relating to Great Salt Lake. This is going to be a big challenge, but at the same time, this is something that's going to, this is something that we are all kind of enmeshed in. And so, I mean, we ultimately, you know, we have a lot of, we do have a lot of control over what each of us does. So anyway, I mean, so I gave a presentation about that. I kind of, you know, developed this out enough to where I felt like I could stand in front of an audience. I gave a presentation about this back in September. And part of it was just an excuse to just get people in the same room, get people talking together and just kind of like connect on that level. But I'm pleased to announce that people are so interested in Great Salt Lake right now that they listened to a historical presentation that lasted like 30, 40 minutes. And people were into it, and people were engaged, and they asked really good questions. And the way that I kind of set it up was, you know, we're looking at a paradox. We've got a paradoxical situation here. everyone knows we live in a desert or a semi-desert. You know, if you want to look at the Wasatch Front and be technical, semi-desert, semi-arid. This is not news to anybody, but we're using water as if, you know, like the tap is just wide open. And the solution to that paradox is we got the tap wide open because this is a desert, right? If you look back, if you trace back settlement, you had boosterism, you had railroad interests and other financial interests, speculators who had an interest in getting people to settle here, to move out here. Well, you know, things change, of course, since 1862. Everyone is aware of that. But hey, Utah is still the fastest growing state in the country. Are we experiencing boosterism 2.0, right? I think sometimes, like, you know, as a historian, you can look back and you can see the way things kind of shake out. And of course, that's messy and complicated, but it is also something that you can kind of put your finger on a little bit. And so if we look back and look at 19th century boosterism and then apply that to the current day, like, hey, maybe this is the same thing going on. Maybe you know, at the root of this problem is this idea that we just have to grow and grow and grow. And, you know, what's the solution to that? Well, that's where it gets really tricky. I mean, Greg Smoke in his keynote, you know, made a point that I enthusiastically echo, which is, you know, don't ask me to predict the future. But I think by having these conversations, by approaching this huge problem, and it really is a big problem. It's as big as any of us want it to be. It's as big as, you know, global climate change. It's as big as you know, extractive capitalism. Like, it's this huge problem. But I think if all of us, you know, if we got a bunch of instigators tackling it and taking pieces of it apart and breaking it off into manageable chunks, then I think that we have, you know, a good chance of getting ourselves, it's going to take time, it's going to take effort, but getting ourselves to a better place. So to go back to this rights of nature idea, I mean, something that I like about this is it's something that is easy for people to understand. It's also not fully fleshed out. And so people can latch on to the idea and then start talking about it. And I think that is an important thing, is to have those conversations and to say, okay, where do we go from here? What does this look like? Because I don't know if there is an answer that anybody can, you know, come out and say is like, hey, this looks like this, but it's going to be figured out, you know, together. And if we're smart, we're going to look to the past and come up with something that will last longer than 100 years, hopefully. Anyway, so Save Our Great Salt Lake is planning a rally for January for the legislative session. Stay tuned if you're interested in connecting and in going to that rally and you know, articulating some of these things to policymakers. You know, please join us. Follow us on Instagram, I think, is probably the best way to stay up to speed. Save Our Great Salt Lake. Anyway, thank you very much. And now I believe Nana's up.
Hi, I'm so glad to be here with you this afternoon. Thanks for sticking it out after a long conference day and staying under the fluorescent lights to be with us and to be with the lake. It's a real honor to be here with Lynn and Nate. My name's Nan. I am a poet and a storyteller primarily, also a teacher and a facilitator of writing practices. And my attention has been very much turned toward the lake in the last year. And so I'm here, I think, in this panel to answer, what's the role of a poet in relation to lake advocacy, or a storyteller? And rather than speak about that, which I could for some time, I'm going to tell you a couple stories, and if there's time, read you a poem. And we'll just see how it works. Like if it works, does it have something to do with advocacy? Poetry is a call to pay attention. That's one thing that poetry is. It's a distilled form of attention. And storytelling is a way to increase empathy. So both rely on metaphor, and metaphor tells you, well, this is like that. So I'm gonna just bring that into the room before I tell you these two stories, so you can wonder yourself, what does this have to do with the lake, these stories? The first one is very direct about the lake. It's the story of the vigil that we kept on Antelope Island in 2022. It like, seems like 5 years ago almost. But I listened to the same Radio West that Nate, I think, referenced. And before then, as much as I loved birds, I spent time at Farmington Bay. I noticed changes in water levels, but I did not know about the peril that the Great Salt Lake is in. I really didn't know until I heard Bonnie Baxter speaking about it on Radio West. And I was alarmed, like many of you. Maybe I know that was a wake-up call for a lot of people. And about then, it started getting coverage and people started listening. And so I started listening to the lake and paying a different kind of attention, going out there more, actually listening, really writing as I was listening to try to take it in. And I was writing pretty obsessively actually about it and listening to the lake pretty obsessively. And I just felt compelled. And in December of last year, 2021, sometime around the 15th of December, in the night, sometimes things would come to me, sometimes words to poems. That doesn't happen to me all the time. I mostly work really hard as a writer to come up with anything, like most of you writers will know what I'm talking about. But sometimes something would come through, and I felt like the lake was giving me things sometimes to say. But in December, the notion of keeping vigil came to me, of actually being present with the lake. And the way that it came, I'm not a person who knew all of the moons before this year, but the invitation that came in the night had something to do with from wolf moon to snow moon, be present with the lake. And I thought, what does that mean? Does it mean camp out, in the winter? And it was like, yeah, actually, like this is really a call to being physically present, not just my attention. So it was kind of a wacky idea if you think of it from a certain circumstance. I'm a middle-aged woman, not a super experienced winter camper. I was like, well, how am I going to do that? I asked a friend who had a camper, someone I didn't actually know very well. Now I know her really well. But I got bold on behalf of the lake. I was like, yeah, I need to actually be there, present on Antelope Island. I looked up those moons, and it so happened that they coincided with the beginning of the Utah State Legislative Session, January 15th last year, through that first month of the session. And I thought, oh, this is partly about being present during the session, being a presence. Oh boy, okay. So yeah, it was that. And a whole series of coincidences or whatever lined up to get me there physically in a camper on January 15th. With just the idea of being present. And the second idea was I can invite people to give me lines of poetry, and I can assemble a collective witness on behalf of the lake. And I put that invitation out on the platforms that I had, held some events on the lake. Really didn't know if people would come to Antelope Island in the winter. Well, they did come. They wanted to come. People came. They came and they shared their experience. They shared their relationship. They thought about who the lake was to them, and they gave me these lines and these specific details very beautifully. And I had other opportunities. Actually, it's interesting that both Lynn and Nate are here, because one was the Alfred Lambert program over a year ago, 2021. It was one of the first events where I just asked people to give lines, like a detail. And there were 80 folks there. I collected 80 details of really loving witness for the lake. And then I was able to compile those into what I call a praise chorus. Just bring those details together. And so all of this, I have so little time left, but right now in this room, in my life, I hope I have more. So I'm trying to think about what is most important to say. We collected the idea, I think that again, that the lake gave me was to collect a number of lines that would reflect a restored water body a fully restored Great Salt Lake. So depending on which scientist you ask, that's 1,700 square mile area, or up to 2,200 square mile area. And I thought, well, I'll just put it out there. I'll commit to this, collecting 1,700 lines of praise and witness for the lake. And it seemed really ambitious when I said that, and said it publicly, but I dared to say it. And I'll say now that this body of work that I'm talking about, which is named Irreplaceable, it's over 2,500 lines of praise, collective witness for the lake. It has over 400 voices in it. Over 400 people came out to Antelope Island and participated in the things we were doing. Some things were as simple as walking to the water. Will take longer this year than it took last year. But we walked the water with people, we wrote with people, we drummed, we hiked, and people stayed and they left their words, they left their witness. So that's a story of the vigil. The idea of the vigil was, when the life of someone you love is at stake, you stay with them. You stay with them. And that was really the defining idea before I knew anything else of what it would be. And a whole community supported it. And I made all these amazing friends. And the lake has been so generous in the gifts that have been given through participating in this witness. So that's the story of the vigil. The story of Irreplaceable will be a published book before the next vigil in the next legislative session. So we'll be keeping vigil again, just starting to plan this. I know that the lake wants us back. And you know, when I went out as one person, it's this interesting thing about being an instigator, right? It's like, who are instigators? The way Daniel McCool defines them in the book that Nate referenced, they are ordinary, broken-hearted people without traditional forms of power. They're not rich people, they're not politically powerful people. You know who they are? They're you and me, probably. You know, just a person with a broken heart willing to show up. That's an instigator. But in Daniel's book, he catalogs a 10-year period of river restoration that absolutely successful, that instigators caused to happen. So that's how it happens. So the fact that you're here under these fluorescent lights, sticking it out, that tells me you're an instigator too. And guess what? We really, really need you. So I have so little time. I want to tell you one more story. Is it okay if I do? We might have to ditch the poetry. Please ask me to read poetry again. I love to, but I think these stories are more important. This story is something that happened in my family last week. And I just felt it was such a, it carries a lot of questions really about who we are in our roles, in our advocacy roles, which I know this is the purpose of this panel. So I'm going to bring it to you. It's about my mother and my brother. My mother's 80. She is a luminous being. She weighs about 100 pounds. She's one of those older women who's like, she's very resilient and strong, but tiny but mighty kind of person. And she's just kind of burned to a shine. I think a life of some very difficult experiences have kind of refined her to a way that she just shines. Her name's Mary Beth. She had a hole in her heart that was a birth defect. And last week, a week ago Monday, she was in the hospital having that repaired. And my brother, who is just a little younger than me, like an Irish twin, his name's Todd. He's a doctor, he's an anesthesiologist. So he was with her in the hospital for the procedure. It wasn't even a surgery, but it was a serious kind of cardiac procedure, came in through her femoral artery, I think, to repair that hole. And he was with her in the hospital while the surgery was happening. And he was with her for a couple of hours after while she was sleeping peacefully and everything seemed fine. And then he went home and she woke up in the hospital, disoriented from anesthesia, bleeding profusely and unable to find the call button. So she's alone and scared and bleeding for some time. And then someone found her in time, I guess, and called my brother. My brother shows up. He asks, you know, how much blood has she lost? It's an important question, right? But nobody knew. And so he goes through the garbage and he finds the bandages, the blood-soaked bandages, and he weighs them in his hands to find out, because he knows, because he's been for decades in hospitals. So there's this kind of advocacy that is about the long-term experience and the expertise. I think Lynn is really bringing that with us today. That is like, I've been paying attention for decades and I know this body, right? And I know what things mean. And so there's some expertise, and he was bringing that. And he weighed the bandages in his hands, and then he talked to the medical professionals there in a very specific way, but told them what he had discovered and asked for the appropriate care, right? What needs to happen now? Who has the power to help? Who has the medicine? And he was that person too, and he in a very clear and I think polite way, asked for the specific help that was needed. But I want to tell you, if he didn't get that help in time, he would have ditched the polite part. And I think it's an important fact. It is to me. So anyway, he does that, and the repair is made. My mother's body is taken care of. The bleeding stops, and he stays the night in an uncomfortable chair, right? So I want to look at that and ask what forms of witnessing happened there, because we're all engaged in relation to the lake. You're here because you care enough to witness. So what kind of witness can you bring? My brother happened to be able to carry at least, I think, 4 actually specific kinds of witness, and you probably, I know everyone in the room can do at least one of these, and you can guess which one, but some of us can do more. So he showed up, he had the expertise to analyze and report, right? So that took a certain kind of experience. So he was an expert witness in one sense. He was a historical witness in another sense, because he spent decades really paying attention to my mother's health and her patterns, and he knows her and knows her medical record, right? So he was also bringing the history that was relevant. That's, I know, relevant to everyone in this room. He was an advocate, a determined advocate, when he's taking that information, reporting it, asking for help, right? So he's like steady and sure in that role, showing up and asking. So those 3 kinds of witness, you may or may not, I may or may not, I don't have the expertise, I'm not the scientist in relation to Great Salt Lake, right? I am interested in the science, trying to learn it, but I'll never be the one who can really tell you about this complex chart of lake levels. I don't know, right? But here's what I can do. I can show up and I can spend the night in that chair. That's what the vigil was, right? And so the question and then here's the other part, here's the meta part. Watch this, I'm gonna move the camera way up. The poet and the storyteller is the one who brings you the story and asks you, who are you in it? Who are you in relation to a dying mother? What will you do in the face of her active collapse? How will you stay with her? That's my job, is to bring you the story, ask the question, and bring it back to relationship, because it's relationship that motivates us the most deeply. And the science and everything else really matters, as you can tell from the story I just told, right? None of that is unimportant, but it's the relational aspect, like, I mean, there's just no question my brother would do those things for my mother. But, going through the trash and pulling out those blood-soaked bandages, that's the loving son of a dying mother who's doing that. So this is a relation, that's the part of the story where the relationship is about being in relationship with a beloved, being an intimate witness with someone you love. And to bring rights of nature back, poetry knows, poetry knows, indigenous ways know, older ways of being. We've lost this in our Western culture, but we know it in our hearts, that this is relational, that the lake is sentient, intelligent, is an ancestor, is due our reverence and our respect, right? So poetry knows those things. I'm sure my time is out, and I'm just like warming up. Like, okay, can I leave you with one poem? Do you mind? Okay, all right. I want to say this is the kind of poetry that has come. It's really classic. If you know the Psalms, for instance, you know that every Psalm is either a praise or a lament. That's what the Psalms are. They're praises and lament. That's what poetry is. That's what most prayers are, praises and laments. And both have come in relation to the lake. And the way that I see that from a historical perspective, this moment, it's like this. Like in 10 years from now, a child that's already born, like a baby, someone who's learning to speak maybe, will have a question for us, for me and for you. And the question will be, it will be one of 2 questions. It could be, tell me what it was like when there was a lake. And it will be a heartbreaking thing for us to remember and talk about the birds and everything else, talk about how it was different. That's one possible future. And it's, I think, a historian's job to weigh it, and also a storyteller's job to weigh it, and a poet's job to weigh it. The other conversation that could happen, the one we're pulling for, we're all here for, is that child will say, tell me again what it was like, how you helped save the lake. Tell me about how you did it. Who was there? How did it happen? And we'll come back to this day, and we'll remember this day when we were all here, and we determined again to be instigators and to keep instigating. We became determined, right? So this poem I want to say that I'm going to read is, it's more in the face of the story we don't want, but it isn't written yet. And it's just the one I feel most compelled to share. It's called Once We Had Everything. Did anyone see the movie Don't Look Up? Anyone? It's a really good movie on Netflix. I recommend it. The prompt actually came from that movie. Once We Had Everything is part of a conversation that happens at the end of the movie. And this poem also references my mother, and when she was a child, she swam in the Great Salt Lake, even though she lived in Idaho. But her mother grew up here, and so they came to the lake to swim. So I'll leave you with this. And you can hear both the lament and the praise in it. I think it holds both. Once we had everything. Once we had everything. We had an island full of bison. We had a sky full of flight. We had a sea full of northern shovelers. In fall, we had an ocean full of grebes, divers with ruby eyes and dark lashes. We had everything. Meadowlarks tuned the morning, coyotes crooned the night. We had a beach full of sand, and each grain a spherical world, not ground but grown. We had circles full of people, bearing stories, some not easy to tell. And yet the tellers told them anyway. We had a basin and a range. We lived on a seafloor. We wanted nothing more than what we dreamt at night when we slept in her generous bed, which once held all the water, the same water which once held my mother, a 9-year-old looking to hers, and her mother who said, "Look how the water holds my large body. She can hold you." And then my mother laughing with delight. And we were once water too. Mirroring the skies, we doubled heaven. We were lyrical, fluid, and lake-voiced. We had a smell ripe with life. We had salt in our eyes. We felt the sting. We were a great body reclaiming. We were a basin yearning to be full again. We were a great lake dreaming herself whole again. Once she had everything. Once we had everything. Thank you.
I don't want to follow that up. That was beautiful. Thank you, all three. Our time is officially up. I think, do we want to ask questions, or everyone needs to roll? Or yeah, I think that's the answer. Come up and ask questions. That was remarkable. Thank you.